G'day guys! The Black Legion have been generating some absolutely fantastic results for me lately. So what I wanted to do in today's video was break down those results, break down my list, and talk to you about some of the different tactics and strategies that I've been using to generate this massive win rate percentage. So with that being said, let's just jump straight into today's video.
Welcome to the Black God!
Hey guys, so the format for today's video, we're basically going to break down the list that I've been running in most of my recent Warhammer 40k competitive tournaments. We're going to break down every warlord trait, strategy, relic, all of that sort of stuff. Then in the second part of the video, we're going to break down all of the tournaments that I've attended and the results that I've achieved at those tournaments. And then we're going to round the video out with an overall view of the strengths and weaknesses of the lists, what I've learned over these many games, and how you can adopt these strategies in your games. So let's get stuck straight into it. So running the Black Legion, I have achieved an 88.46% win rate. So I went to the Menza Masquerade GT and went 5-0, 5 wins, no losses. Then I went to the Risky Rollers annual event where I got 3 wins, no losses. Went to Uprising ITC Major, where I got 6 wins and 2 losses. Then I went to the Strength in Numbers Teams event, got 5 wins, no losses. And the Gladiator Teams events, where I went 4 wins and only 1 loss. So that gives me a total of 23 wins and only 3 losses out of 26 games. So this win rate percentage is huge, especially considering that GW have just released their reports where they've got Chaos Space Marines win rate at below 50%. So seeing that one Legion within the CSM options has been doing absolutely amazing means that we have the potential to bring this faction up if more people are prepared to adopt this similar playstyle, a similar list, a similar Legion. I understand that a lot of Chaos Space Marine players have a particular Legion that they prefer and they want to stick with that for the narrative purposes, and that's 100% understandable. However, if you want to get competitive and you want to start dominating tournaments, you need to start looking into the Black Legion, and hopefully this video is your first step along the way. Alright guys, before we get into the list, I just want to do a quick shout out to Team Australia for the Warhammer 40k World Team Championships. This year I have been selected to represent Team Australia, represent Australia over there in the World Championships. I'm absolutely thrilled and excited to be part of the team. And one of the ways that we're celebrating this is we've just got ourselves a brand new website, an official website for Team Australia. On that website you can find out all kinds of information about this year's team as well as teams in years past. You can find information on how you can join the team if you happen to be an Australian that's looking to get involved in this sort of really high-end Warhammer 40k. And there's also some exciting information there about a raffle that's available to all Australian residents, and you can go on there, you can join the raffle. There's some really awesome prizes up for grabs, and all of the money generated from that raffle will help Team Australia fly across the world to represent the highest level of Australian Warhammer 40k. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure you check out www.teamoz40k.com.au. I'm really excited to be part of the team this year, and I really hope you jump over to that website, check it out, and join that raffle for some exciting prizes and to show your support for the team. Now let's get into the Black Legion list. Alright, so the list that I've been running for all of these events is a single Arcs of Omen detachment. We have Abaddon the Despoiler with all of his warlord traits. We have the Master of Possessions. He takes Mark of Slaanesh, Liber Hereticus as a relic, and then for his powers he takes Mutated Invigoration, Pact of Flesh, and Delightful Agonies. We then have a Dark Apostle. He also takes the Mark of Slaanesh. He has the Cloak of Conquest for a relic, Illusory Supplication, Blissful Devotion as his 2 prayers to the Dark Gods. Then we have a Sorcerer in Terminator Armor. He also has a relic, which is the Veilbreaker Plate. He takes Warp Time and Diabolical Strength. For our troops choices, we've got 2 × 10 cultists, and they get all the free war gear now, so they got a flamer, a grenade launcher, a heavy stubber, and I give them all combat weapons. Then we take a big 10-man brick of Terminators. These guys take the Mark of Slaanesh, the Black Rune of Damnation, 2 Chain Fists, 2 Power Fists, and 4 Combi Melters in the unit. Everybody else with Accursed Weapons and Combi Bolters. Then we take a unit of 5 Raptors, all with chainswords and bolt pistols. In our Elites slots, we have 3 Hellbrutes, all of them with Multi-Melter, Heavy Flamer, and Hellbrute Fists. And then we round the list out with 2 Decimators, both of them equipped with Twin Soulburner Petards. Alright, so that's the list. That's the nuts and bolts of it. That's all of these things that you will require. Now, you'll note that this is a very, very small list. It's basically 4 characters with a Terminator brick, creating a bit of a Death Star, and then some things like Hellbrutes and Decimators for ranged fire support and strategic reserves to bring in later in the game. We'll go through all of the strategy on how we use each one of these elements and some of the results that we've been able to achieve. If you want a little bit more information, I did, at the start of Uprising, I did a deep dive on this list where I broke down every stratagem that we use, every warlord trait, every relic in great detail. So I'll link that video in the description below if you want a bit more information on the very, very specific elements of this list. I also, after Uprising and after Menza Masquerade, did a separate video for each game that I played. So a deep dive on the opponent, a deep dive on the results, a deep dive on the secondaries that I selected. So there's plenty of information out there on those 2 events. Since then, I've gone to another 2 events. So I wanted to basically recap those 2 events in their entirety, combine it with the results from Uprising, combine it with the results from Menza Masquerade, and give you guys a really holistic view of the Black Legion and the potential that they have on the tabletop. So let's get into the results from the first tournament I took this list to. Alright, so the first tournament that I took this to was the Menza Masquerade. I played 5 games. The first game was against Imperial Knights, where I got a 93 to 83 point win. The Imperial Knight list contained 1 big knight and lots of armigers. Then I played against Harlequins in the next round, got a 95 to 57 point win. Their list was full of MSU boats with lots of transports, combining units of troops, so lots and lots of Harlequins on the table. Then I went into Demons, got a 95 to 91 point win, so a very close game. This was a Demons list that contained Scarbrand, the phase-capped Bloodthirster, and lots of pre-nerf Flamers. So this was before the balanced data slate came through and nerfed the Flamers. Then I went up against Genestealer Cult, got a 93 to 53 point win. So the Genestealer Cult list had 3 big units of bikers and 150 odd little guys, the little neophyte hybrids or whatever they're called. Then I went in the final round, I got a 77 to 70 point draw against the Demons, and basically that was the same Demon list, but different player, with Scarbrand, phase-capped Bloodthirster, lots of pre-nerf Flamers. And then basically that draw ended up going back to tiebreakers to see who won the event, and it turned out that I was ahead in battle points, so that's what secured me that first place at the Menza Masquerade. Menza Masquerade was an absolute ripper of an event, and as you can see, there was some really, really close games in there. A couple of them were blowouts, like into the Genestealer Cults and into the Harlequins, but most of the games were pretty tight. You will find a consistent theme throughout this, that the Black Legion, they win games, but they generally don't win by a massive margin, and we'll explain why that is the case towards the end of the video when we're talking about the strengths and weaknesses of the Black Legion. Alright, the next event that I went to was the Risky Rollers Annual. So I played 3 games at this event. The first was a 97 to 46 point win against Assyriani. They had mixed MSU aspect warriors with lots of psychers. They had a Hemlock, they had Striking Scorpions, they had Banshees, they had all kinds of crazy stuff. Then I went 90 to 80 point win into Sisters of Battle. This was a Bloody Rose combat heavy list with lots of MSU trading pieces, lots of small units of Repentia, Zephyrum, Arcoflagellants, lots of stuff. And then the final round was a 91 to 42 point win into the Salamanders. So they had lots of aggressors, eradicators, attack bikes with melter guns, Thunderhammer guys, all kinds of crazy damage output there. Alright, this one may look like it was not that impressive because it was just a little RTT, it was small, there wasn't a massive number of players. However, there were some very high quality players at this event, and of the 3 people that I versed, one of them was a World Team Championships gold medalist, and another one has been selected for Victorian State Team as one of the representatives of the best that our state can muster. So this was a smaller event, but it was by no means any easier to score those big victory points and those big wins. So very interesting little event, but managing to go undefeated with the Black Legion again. All right, now we get into the big one, Uprising, the Australian ITC Championships. So this was an 8-round event. The first game was 82 to 52 point win into Imperial Knights. So this was a full armature list. They had a shit ton of Helverins and a shit ton of Warglades, and I managed to get that big 82 point, 52 point win. Then I got my first loss in some time, 58 point loss into a 93 point score for the Raven Wing. So this list had lots of Black Knights and other high damage output fast units. Then I went into Harlequins, managed to claw in a tiny win of 85 to 83 points into Harlequins. They had, again, full MSU troops and transports, lots of small units of bikes, little annoying things running around. Then we played into the new Imperial Guard for the first time, and I got a 97 to a 70 point win, a 77 point win. They had the standard, like lots of Kaskin units backed up by 7 Lehman Russ battle tanks with plasma guns all over them. Then we played into Dark Eldar, an 88 to 84 point win, so another very close game. This one had MSU combat units in transports, lots of witches, incubi, Court of Archon, all that sort of stuff. And then we went into Dark Angels again. This time I got an 87 to 77 point win. I learned some lessons from my previous game. And this was pre-nerf plasma and scepters, as well as lots of Ravenwing bikes, those Black Knights. Then we went into Custodes. We got a 77 to 68 point win. There was lots of Wardens there. There was also a solo Allurus Terminators with Sister of Silence. And then we went 93 to 37 points into Custodes again. Heavy mech. There was lots of Dreadnoughts and Grav tanks in this one. Alright, so this was the Australian ITC Championships, and this pulled some of the best players from all around the country, and these are some of the best players in the world. So one of the people that I versed was Adam Camilleri, who was one of the ones I lost to, and he was running this absolutely oppressive Black Knights list. The other thing worth noting in these sorts of games is it's 8 rounds and you play all the way through, so it becomes absolutely grueling by the end. So it's as much a contest of stamina as it is a contest of intellect. So very interesting, these big 8-round events. They also did something interesting in this event, which I won't go into in too much detail, but it does provide some important context, is that they had a pod system where basically you play all your games on the first 2 days, and then on the third day, those last 2 rounds, you were locked in to a 4-person range. So even if you win those 2 games, you can still only go up or down within that 4-placing range. So the last 2 games on the day 3, they don't really matter too much unless you happen to be in that top pod or you're fighting for, somewhere between 5th and 8th. You want to, you can go from 8th to 5th, but you can never go from 8th to 2nd or 3rd or whatever. So the pod system was interesting. It did mean that those last 2 games for people in my pod didn't really matter. So we sort of just fooled around with it a bit, had a little bit more fun with it. So those games, not that important, but the 6 games leading up to it were very hard fought games against some really top tier players. I played against the captain of the Canberra team for the Australian Team Championships. I played against the captain of the Western Australian team, so some really top tier players there, and I also played against World Team Championship representatives, so it was really hard fought battles. A lot of those games were also very close. You'll notice there was a few where there was like 3 or 4 points in it, so a single turn of primary could have flipped that game. So really interesting, and we will go through that in detail towards the end of the video and talk about ways that you can make sure that that never actually matters. So it's really important that way that this list pilots, it's very different than your standard list. So let's get into the next tournament though, shall we? Next up we had Strength in Numbers. So this was a teams event. So basically the way the scoring in this one works is it's between a 0 and a 20. You can never score higher than 20, you can never score lower than 0, and it's based on a victory point differential. So my first game was a 20-0 win into Chaos Knights. They had 2 Big Knights and 6 War Dogs. Then I got an 11-9 win into the Leagues of Votann. They had lots of bikes, the chunky Terminator wannabes, a land fortress, a bunch of the Devastator looking dudes, all that sort of stuff, all that fun Leagues of Votann jank. Then we had an 18-2 point win into Imperial Guard. This one again had the multiple Kasrkin units backed up by Lehman Russ plasma tanks. We got a 12-8 point win into Demons. This was a pure Tzeentch demon army, so no Bloodthirsters, no Scarbrand, but they had a boatload of Psychers. They had the Big Lord of Change, they had a bunch of Flamers, they had all types of stuff. And then for the last round, I got a 20-0 win into Imperial Guard with multiple Kasrkin units backed up by Lehman Russ plasma again. Alright, so this one being a teams event, it's an interesting thing because you can sort of manipulate your pairings. You can sort of pick who you're going to verse in a lot of instances. However, that doesn't always work in your favor. Sometimes you will look into the lineups of your opponents and you'll decide that we're going to put one list up, and that list is vulnerable because your opponent gets to decide who versus you. And that often happened with me, where I was put up and then the opposing team got to pick which one of their 4 players or their 5 players would verse me. And as a result, I was constantly thrown into challenging matchups, and I had to try to pull out tricks to get these big wins. Wasn't always the case, but sometimes it was. So whilst it was a teams event, and it's sometimes teams events lists can be quite, results can be quite interesting because you can just pair yourself into favorable matchups and look like a rock star, wasn't necessarily the case in this event. It's also worth noting that the differential is an interesting way of doing the scores, where basically the more you beat your opponent by, the more victory points you get. So to get a 20-0, you have to really poleaxe your opponent and do massive amounts of damage and get a huge differential in your scores. So for those 20-0 wins, that could be the equivalent of like a 93 to 40 point win. Whereas the ones where I got like an 11-9 win, that's where it's real close. That's like an 85 to 80 point win. So for those looking at those scores, that's sort of how that team's dynamic sort of works. Now let's get into the next event, which again was another teams event. Played Gladiator Games. This one, I got a 16-4 win into the Genestealer cult. Again, this one had 3 units of bikers supported by 150 odd little dudes and a bunch of characters throughout. Then I got to play the World Eaters, which I was very excited for because going forward, I am going to be playing World Eaters at all future events. They had an 18-2 point win to me. They had 2 units of 8-bound, and then they had a Lord Invocatus plus a bunch of Berserkers in Rhinos. Really cool list, but not enough to take down the Black Legion. Then I got a 12-8 point win into Assyriani. They had mixed MSU Aspect Warriors with lots of Psychers, some D-Cannons, all kinds of stuff there. I got a 0-20 point loss, an absolute destroyed result into Genestealer Cult. They had rock grinders, they had trucks full of dudes, and like 120 more dudes in reserve, so real powerful list. And then I swung that back in my favor in the last round and got a 20-0 win into AdMech. They had lots of breaches, they had destroyers, they had those infiltrating combat dudes, a whole bunch of stuff there. So again, this was another teams event where we got to have at least some control over who played who. Often I was put up because I would either have pretty decent expected results into most people on their team, or I'd have bad predicted results into most people on their team. So either way, I was either able to be put up and pretty much lock in a win, or I wasn't going to get a win anyway, so we might as well put me up and let them just farm me because I wasn't going to get a win anyway. So the big note here was that I played 2 Genestealer Cult players at this event. One of them I destroyed, and then the other one destroyed me. So this is really interesting, and I will talk about that player that destroyed me in great detail in a future video because he did some really, really clever tricks that absolutely put the stoppers on my army. So we'll talk about that in a separate video. I'm going to do a deep dive on it. Needless to say, this was another one of the Team Australia representatives from last year, world champion, arguably one of the best players in the entire world. He's an absolute killer, Eric Lathuris. You probably heard his name before, and he is an absolute master on those Genestealer cults. So when you take a master on the Black Legion and you put him into a master on the Genestealer cults, it becomes very apparent that the Genestealer cults have the edge. And all of my previous games where I've beaten Genestealer cult players were due to being outplayed, not because of the list advantage. So we're going to talk about ways that I was outplayed and ways that I was able to outplay my opponents as well, so that you can hopefully replicate those results in your games. All right, now let's talk about some of the strengths and the weaknesses of this list and what I've learned over the 26 games that I've played with this list. And these aren't just 26 practice games. These are tournament games against people who are trying as hard as they can to win. These are serious games, and I learned some serious lessons from them. So let's get looking at the strengths of the list first. All right, so the first one is Black Legion's Legion trait. So getting +1 to hit in combat and shooting is very strong and makes things like Decimators super reliable. It's super strong with Terminators, Hellbrutes who can fight and shoot well. Then we've got Abaddon. He's insane value in some matchups when opponents cannot deal with him. And he's also a massive force multiplier. Being able to heal him in-game is also game-breaking. Then we've got the Terminators. So these guys have higher damage output than any other Legion and have access to some amazing stratagems and buffs from various relics. Speaking of relics, Black Legion have some of the best relics in the game, The Veiled Praetor Plate further enhances your Terminator's mobility, and the Cloak of Conquest gives you objective secured, which is critical when you're building a Death Star style game. Now let's look at some of the stratagems they've got. Picking a Legion trait is amazing. Being able to gain all 3 wontons on a unit that's able to do damage in shooting and melee is really, really good. Also, being able to fall back, advance, shoot, charge, they're all great and they all come from various different stratagems, but having the option to do any or all of those things is very, very powerful, particularly when you've got a Death Star, which is one big unit. And then you've also got the fact that those Terminators can heroically intervene, which makes it very, very hard for your opponent to play around them on objectives. Then we've got reserves. So all legions have access to reserves, but I think Black Legion get the most out of them because you can present only the Terminators as a valid target, with the Decimators and Hellbrutes in reserves, which allows you to dictate when and where the fight will happen. So this Death Star style list, where you've got that one big Terminator unit with a bunch of supporting characters inside, it only works if you're able to absolutely get every drip of value out of that Terminator unit. So by being able to put everything else in reserves means that your opponent can't shoot anything else, they can't charge anything else, they can't do anything, so they're only going to be able to deal with those Terminators, which is exactly what you want them to do, because every bullet they put into the Terminators is coming at significantly decreased utility because of all your layered buffs and whatever. And it also means if they want to get in combat with you, well, they have to get in combat with your big, scary combat unit. So this is a really powerful dynamic, and it relies on you getting all of the value out of those Terminators. So everything in this list, every combo is designed around getting power out of those Terminators. The Relics, being able to teleport the Terminators, giving the Terminators objective secured. Abaddon, giving reroll hits and wounds to the Terminators instead of other legions where he just gives them the reroll hits. You know, the Master of Possessions being able to buff the toughness or strength of those Terminators. So depending on what you need for the given situation, you can either make them charge in at strength 6, or you can make them toughness 5, depending on the damage profiles of your opponent's attacks. So real power there. And then you've also got stratagems that are really, really good when you have one big unit. Stratagems, by the nature of you selecting them and applying them to a unit, means that the bigger the unit, the more value you get out of that stratagem. So for example, being able to fall back, shoot, and then charge something. That's really, really good when you put it on a big Death Star unit, right? If you put that on a unit of 5 Legionaries, who cares? It's 5 Legionaries. They're going to fall back, they're going to shoot something, they're going to charge something. Cool story. Whereas when you put it on a big unit of 10 Terminators, and they're able to fall back, blast something with 1 billion bolters, and then charge something and hit them with 1 billion accursed weapons that are all rerolling hits and wounds from Abaddon, it just makes this one Terminator unit an absolute bully on the tabletop. You know, there's tons of examples of stratagems in this codex that are really powerful on that Death Star. Another example is being able to heroically intervene. You know, who cares if you can heroically intervene with small units? That's not that big of a scary threat. But when you have that big Terminator unit and you stretch it out across 2 objectives, and you've got this model's holding that objective, that one's holding that objective, they're strung together for coherency, and now if your opponent tries to take this objective, you can heroically intervene. If they try to take this objective, you can heroically intervene. And that way, no matter where their opponent goes, no matter what they do, they have to deal with this Terminator unit, and if they can't deal with it, well then they can't win. So having that Death Star unit is really, really powerful, and Black Legion in particular are very, very good at getting all of the value out of that Terminator Death Star. Now, you're probably looking at that and thinking, wow, how can this Death Star be dealt with? It does massive amounts of damage and it's practically unkillable. It's able to string out across multiple objectives and control the table. This list is absolutely busted, and you're not entirely wrong. That being said, it does have some very notable weaknesses. These are things that got me into situations where the games were very, very close. So let's talk about some of the weaknesses, some of the things that you need to know if you want to try to get better at piloting the Black Legion, and something that you would need to know if you want to verse the Black Legion. Not everybody's going to be a Black Legion player that watches this video. Some people are going to want to know what my tricks and, you know, all my strengths and weaknesses are, so that when they're versing a Black Legion player, they know what to do. So let's talk about some of the weaknesses of the Black Legion. So the first one is their secondary objectives. It's really, really hard when your opponent doesn't give up easy kill secondaries, because you will often get low scoring wins. You know, there's no particular secondaries that are powerful for the Black Legion. We also have very few units because everything is tied up in the Terminator Death Star. So you have very little for scoring objectives, screening enemy units, those sorts of things. You're also very much at the mercy of the dice. Relying on key powers and prayers is a risky way to play 40k, as you can become very vulnerable if you fail a clutch power. You're also not very flexible. When the units arrive from reserve/teleport, after that, they are very, very slow. So fast enemies can sort of hit and run you very effectively. And then the last thing is that you have sort of got a single source of damage. The vast majority of the damage comes from a single Terminator unit, so if people can navigate around it or kill it, you're in trouble. This is definitely one of the hard parts about running this list. When you come time to selecting your secondary objectives, it doesn't really have any that are good. I was often taking Warp Ritual, which at best is 12 points, and then I would often end up taking something like Banners and score around 10 points, or I might take the Long War, score about 10 points, or Grind Them Down, score 9 to 12 points. Like, these were not very good secondaries. It's really, really hard to score high. So if my opponent didn't give up anything, it was hard. If they gave up something like Bring It Down or Assassinate or No Prisoners or something like that, and I was able to go in and get those points, it was much easier. But when people design their lists, the top players, when they design their list, they make sure that it only gives up 10 points for Assassinate, it only gives up 9 to 10 points for Bring It Down, it only gives up 9 points for No Prisoners, those sorts of things. And now it's like, well, you can select those secondaries, but you're not going to get a huge score. You'd have to table them to get 9 points. So it becomes very difficult to score high. However, what this list does do quite well is dominate the primary and stop your opponent from scoring. Because when people verse me, they're getting, I think it was a maximum of 7 points for Bring It Down, because I don't have a massive number of tanks in my list. They could get high on Assassinate, but they're almost never going to break through that Terminator brick and kill all your characters. So no one was taking Assassinate, no one's taken Bring It Down. No Prisoners, it gives even less. I think it gives like a 6 or a 7 point No Prisoners score, so no one's taking that. So it's very, very hard to score victory points off this list. But it's also, if your opponent has a similar list, you're going to get a very low scoring game. The other weaknesses are the fact that it's got very few units. So if your opponent has, multiple units, like the Sisters of Battle, for example, they can often trade up. They'll go kill a Decimator, a Hellbrute, whatever, and then they'll still be alive. And then all of a sudden, you have one Terminator unit trying to deal with 10 Sisters of Battle units. And that can be very, very challenging because the Terminator unit can't be everywhere at once. So positioning that Terminator unit to make sure that it is able to deal with as much as possible is really key. So going up into the center of the table, stringing out, trying to predict where your opponent's going to go and start heading in that direction the turn prior, so that way, if they go there, you're closer to them, and if they don't go there, well, you've sectioned off that area of the board. Really, really important. And it's also really, really important to make sure that you're always getting shooting damage out of that Terminator unit as well as combat damage. Every turn you need to be shooting something and killing it and charging something and killing it. Because if you have one unit that just trades for one unit every turn, you're not getting the value. That's a 420 point unit plus about 500 points worth of characters. That's essentially 1,000 points of your army. If you're spending 1,000 points to just kill one thing every turn, you're not going to win the game. You need to make sure that you're killing several things every single turn in order to make sure your opponent doesn't just roll over you. And having very few units in your army makes that very difficult to do. Being at the mercy of the dice is also absolutely terrifying. If you fail that illusory supplication, well, now all of a sudden your opponent can deal massive damage to you. If you fail delightful agonies or mutated invigoration, you can become very, very vulnerable to enemy shooting and combat damage. So you're kind of at the mercy of the dice here. You need to be able to rely on those powers going off for you to be able to be successful. One of the things about this list, however, is that the Veilbreaker plate is something that's done in your movement phase, but things like Illusory Supplication is done in your command phase. So what you can do is you roll your Illusory Supplication, and if you fail, you just don't Veilbreaker that turn. You just stay hidden out of line of sight somewhere, so your opponent can't hurt you, and then you try again next turn. You can also, in certain situations, spend 2 command points to automatically pass Illusory Supplication, which means that you will just definitely be able to send them out and be relatively safe. However, you're not always going to have the command points to do this, so it's a very clutch play. It's something that you need to, factor and decide on the day. In this situation, is it critical? So, for example, if you go up against an opponent and you get first turn, and you look at the way that they've deployed and they've screened themselves so that if you do Veilbreaker, you'll be able to get on that central objective, you'll be able to blow up a couple of things, you'll be able to do some damage, but you will be relatively exposed in doing so, well then you might actually go, you know what, I'm not going to roll the dice. I need to kill those things, and killing those things will leave me exposed, so I need Illusory Supplication to go off. Well then you might spend the CP to do it. Whereas if you go, well, they've actually deployed in such a way that I can kill a bunch of things and then pin something and keep it locked in combat, which means I'm going to be protected from their shooting, and they don't have massive combat damage, so I actually don't necessarily need Illusory Supplication. Well, in that situation, you just roll for it. And if you get it, that's fine, that's great. If you don't get it, it's not that big of a deal because you're able to go in. There's also some matchups where Illusory Supplication isn't quite as relevant, like in the guard matchup. By and large, they're hitting you on 4s anyway, with a lot of their sponsons on the tanks and whatever, and they also don't have a massive amount of rerolls outside of that Castican bomb, so turning off their rerolls to hits not that big of a deal. Similar into Tau, so sometimes it's not that big of a deal, other times it's fucking huge. Also, when it comes to your psychic powers, relying on Delightful Agonies, which is a 6, very, very hard. So choosing the sequence of your powers is very important. Knowing which order you want to do the powers in, so that if you fail one of them, you can command point reroll it. You need to make sure that you get that down pat. So the idea is you want to make sure that you do your most important powers first, so that if you fail, you can command point reroll it. There's nothing worse than when you fail a relatively unimportant power, then you go, oh, I'm going to CP reroll it anyway because I do want that power. You CP reroll, you pass, and then you fail your next power, which is the actual really important one. So you got to make sure that you do your most important powers first. However, with Delightful Agonies, that's tricky because when you're doing the Terminator bomb, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with this trick now, where the Master of Possessions stabs a Terminator, kills him, and then you use Pact of Flesh to resurrect him closer. So you gain that extra movement, and it's also really good for deep strike charges. If you're planning to do that, you actually don't want Delightful Agonies yet. You want to be able to stab things and kill them, then resurrect them, then do Delightful Agonies. So having that sequence forces Delightful Agonies to be the last power that you cast, but often it's the one you want to save the CP reroll for. So it's a tricky sort of situation to navigate, and being at the mercy of the dice, it's very anxiety producing because you're like, every game you're kind of at the mercy of the dice. You can fail a bunch of charges, you can fail a bunch of shots, but with the Death Star style of play, there's like 2 critical rolls that matter. There's, did I get my Illusory Supplication? Did I get my Pact of Flesh for the resurrection? And did I make my 5-inch charge? Those 3 things will determine the game. Because you have so much layered defense, your defensive rolls, like your armor saves and stuff, aren't really that important because you've got so many layers of defense, it's really hard for them to break through. And you do such massive damage, your hit rolls and your wound rolls don't really matter that much. You'll very rarely target something and fail to kill it. Especially when you've got rerolls to hit and rerolls to wound from Abaddon. Your dice rolls are very, very flat and very consistent throughout the game. They don't spike a lot. Whereas, failing Illusory Supplication, that's a 1d6 roll. You got a 1 in 6 chance of failing it. That can be a disaster. And that's 1 dice. So it's sort of like taking all of the aggregate luck that you would expect throughout the game and channeling it all into 1 dice roll. And if that dice roll goes your way, you're good. If it doesn't, you're in trouble. So you really are more at the mercy of the dice with the Death Star style list than in any other list format. And yeah, so that more or less wraps up what I wanted to talk about with the Black Legion. We've talked about the list, we've talked about some of the strengths, the weaknesses, the different matchups that I've had. Again, if you want to know more detail about the specific stratagems that I use regularly, the specifics on the Warlord traits, how they work, the specific combos, I've done multiple videos on Black Legion. This will be the last video that I will do on the Black Legion because I am now pivoting into exclusively World Eaters for the next few months. I will still talk about different combos in the CSM as they come to mind and as people ask questions. So if you want to know more about any CSM stuff, chuck your comments below because I have been deep diving this codex for the last, nearly 12 months now, I guess. And I've got a lot of ideas. There's still got a lot of videos in my to-do list of things that I want to record and talk about for the Chaos Space Marines. But for tournaments going forward, I'm going to be playing exclusively World Eaters, and I'm going to be basically starting the process now of deep diving that book and deep diving the combos there, all the way up until 10th edition when that comes out. So if you want to know more about any Chaos Space Marine stuff, make sure you let me know in the comments below. If you want to know anything about World Eaters, or you have any particular things you want me to trial out and test there for you, I'll be attending a whole ton of tournaments coming up, and I'll be running World Eaters at all of them. So really looking forward to testing that out. So let me know if there's anything you want to know about that. And also, if you want to show your support for the channel, you can do so by joining over on our Patreon. We have a Discord community there that you'll gain access to. You can also get apparel like this. Check out the link in the description below for blogforthebloodgod.com.au. That's a brilliant little website where it compiles all of the stuff that you need to know about this channel, all of the different merchandise, ways to support. It's got some articles on there as well, so if your video format isn't necessarily always going to be your thing, there's articles that you can read whilst taking a shit at work, those sorts of things. There's lots of different stuff on that website, so make sure you check that out. And as always, thanks for tuning in. I will see you in the next one. Cheers.
Welcome to the Black God.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor a mad cunt like Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel, unsustainable, and your fault.